The year is 1912. The desert of Tel El Amarna stretches out in every direction, pale, silent, and ancient in the way that makes modern men feel like they have wandered into someone else's dream. A German archaeological team, led by Ludwig Borchardt, is carefully sifting through the ruins of what was once a thriving city. Dust coats everything. The sun is merciless, and most of what they find are fragments, broken pottery, crumbled walls, half-finished carvings that time decided were not worth saving. It is painstaking, unglamorous work, the kind of work where weeks pass, and the most exciting discovery is a doorframe. And then, on the afternoon of December 6th, one of the excavators reaches into the rubble of a collapsed workshop and pulls out something that does not belong to the world of broken things. She is intact. She is painted. She is waiting. Nefertiti, 3,000 years in the dark, and not a single apology on her face. The bust is breathtaking in a way that bypasses intellectual appreciation and goes straight for something deeper, something almost unsettling, because she does not look ancient. She looks present. The cheekbones sit high and sharp, sculpted with the kind of precision that modern artists still study and quietly envy. The neck is long, elegant, almost architectural, as if her body was designed specifically to carry that extraordinary blue crown. The skin tones are warm and layered, pigment blended so carefully that even after 30 centuries, it refuses to fade into irrelevance. And her expression, calm, knowing, slightly unreachable, carries the particular energy of someone who has already decided they are the most important person in the room, and simply has not bothered to announce it yet. One eye is missing, the left socket is smooth and empty, like a sentence that ends without a period. And rather than diminishing her, that absence somehow amplifies everything. She feels more human for it, more haunting, more real. The world, when it finally saw her, did not know what to do with her. She was placed in a Berlin museum and promptly became one of the most visited, most photographed, most debated objects in the entire history of human art. Not a painting, not a monument, a sculptor's model, because here is the quiet, almost comedic truth that her legend prefers you to overlook. Most scholars believe the Nefertiti bust was never a finished royal portrait. It was almost certainly a workshop reference piece, a master template that sculptors would use to replicate the Queen's features across official commissions. Ancient Egypt's equivalent of a pinned reference image on a studio wall. A practice draft. A working copy. The most recognized face in human history may owe its immortality to the fact that someone in Amarna forgot to clean up before they left. And yet, look closer. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Even as a model, it was executed with devotion. Ancient Egyptian art was never casual. It was propaganda carved into permanence. Representation equaled power. So if this was only the reference version, imagine the full portrait. Imagine what they considered finished. She mastered image long before the modern world invented the term, and she made sure her face would survive long enough to make us argue about her forever. Not bad for a practice piece. Here is the first thing you should know about Nefertiti. We do not know where she came from. That sounds like a small problem. It is not. In ancient Egypt, lineage was everything. Birth was destiny. The names of your parents, your city, your bloodline, these were not personal details. They were credentials. They were carved into walls and painted into tombs so that the gods themselves could read your resume. Pharaohs traced their ancestry back to the divine. Even noblemen made sure the record knew exactly who their fathers were. And yet Nefertiti, the woman who would become the most powerful queen Egypt had ever seen, arrives in the historical record with almost no introduction at all. No origin story. No childhood inscriptions. No proud father announcing her birth to the temple walls. She simply appears, already magnificent, already beside the throne, already wearing the crown like she was born knowing its weight. Scholars have spent decades arguing over the gap. Some believe she was Egyptian, perhaps the daughter of a high-ranking court official named Ai, a man who would later become Pharaoh himself in the chaos that followed her husband's reign. This theory is tidy and politically satisfying. Others argue she was foreign-born, possibly a princess from Mitanni, a powerful kingdom to the north, sent to Egypt as a diplomatic gift wrapped in silk and political ambition. This theory is harder to prove, but considerably more interesting. And then there are those who suggest her very name holds the clue. Nefertiti. In ancient Egyptian it means, with breathtaking simplicity, the beautiful one has come. Not the beautiful one was born here. Not the beautiful one grew up among us. She came. From somewhere. And wherever that somewhere was, she arrived already fully formed. What we do know is this. She became the great royal wife of Amenhotep IV, a young pharaoh who would soon rename himself Akhenaten and proceed to turn 3,000 years of Egyptian religion upside down with the calm confidence of a man who believed the gods had personally endorsed his renovation plans, and Nefertiti did not stand quietly at his side while he did it. From the very beginning, the imagery tells a different story. She is everywhere. Temple reliefs show her not in the traditional pose of a supportive royal wife, graceful, decorative, slightly behind, but in positions of active divine authority. There are carvings of Nefertiti driving a chariot, carvings of her grasping enemies by the hair and raising a weapon above them, a pose so exclusively reserved for pharaohs that its appearance in connection with a queen still makes historians stop mid-sentence and recalibrate. She wore not one crown but several, each carrying specific religious and political meaning. The tall, flat-topped blue crown, the one the bust made famous, was not decorative fashion. It was a statement of cosmic authority. Queens did not simply choose their headwear the way a modern woman might select an accessory. Every element of royal appearance was a language, and Nefertiti was apparently fluent in all of it. She also gave Akhenaten 6 daughters, not sons, daughters. In a culture obsessed with male heirs, this could have been her vulnerability. Instead, she turned even this into visual power, surrounding herself in official imagery with her daughters like a living constellation, projecting abundance and divine femininity so deliberately that it reads less like family portraiture and more like a carefully managed public relations campaign. And underneath all of it, the crowns, the carvings, the careful imagery, a woman whose origins remain deliberately, perhaps strategically, unclear. Because maybe that was always the point. Maybe Nefertiti understood something that most rulers take lifetimes to learn. That mystery is its own kind of power. That a woman without a traceable past cannot be easily defined, categorized, or dismissed. She came, and she made sure no one would ever quite agree on where from. To understand what Nefertiti and Akhenaten did together, you first need to understand what they were dismantling. Egypt in the 14th century before the Common Era was simply a civilization. It was a theological ecosystem, vast, intricate, and ancient even by the standards of people who considered themselves ancient. The gods were everywhere and in everything. Amun, the hidden king of the gods, reigned supreme from his great temple complex at Karnak, where priests accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled the pharaoh himself. Ra sailed his solar bark across the sky each day. Osiris presided over the dead. Isis spread her wings over the grieving. Horus watched with falcon eyes from every temple wall. These were not metaphors. They were not stories told to comfort children at night. They were the architecture of reality itself, the invisible scaffolding upon which Egyptian society had been built and rebuilt for thousands of years. And then Akhenaten looked at all of it and decided, with the serene certainty of a man who has never once doubted his own instincts, that he would like to replace it, all of it, with one god, a sun disk, the Aten. What followed was not a gentle theological suggestion. It was a revolution, swift, radical, and deeply personal in the way that only religious conviction can make a political act feel. Akhenaten declared the Aten the sole true deity of Egypt. The old gods were not merely demoted, they were erased. Their names were chiseled from temple walls across the country. Their priesthoods were disbanded. Their temples were stripped of funding and relevance. Amun, the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, had his very name attacked with hammer and chisel wherever it appeared on stone. Even inside private tombs, where a man's relationship with the gods was considered the most sacred and personal thing he possessed, the old names were scraped away. It was, by any measure, one of the most audacious acts of religious restructuring in all of human history. And Nefertiti was not watching from a respectful distance while her husband swung the metaphorical hammer. She was co-architect, co-priest, and quite possibly co-visionary of the entire undertaking. The evidence is written in stone, which in Egypt means it was meant to last forever. Temple reliefs from the early Aten period show Nefertiti and Akhenaten performing religious rituals together in a way that was entirely unprecedented. In traditional Egyptian religious practice, the pharaoh was the intermediary between humanity and the divine, the one human being whose spiritual authority was absolute and untransferable. No queen had ever stood beside that authority as an equal participant. And yet here was Nefertiti, depicted in scene after scene making offerings to the Aten alongside Akhenaten, her figure nearly the same scale as his, and in ancient Egyptian art, scale was not aesthetic preference. Scale was hierarchy made visible. There are images of her shaking the sacred sistrum, a ritual instrument, in ceremonies that would have previously been the exclusive domain of the pharaoh. There are depictions of her wearing the double crown, the Atef crown, and the blue war crown interchangeably, each one a coded statement about the scope of her divine role. In some temple scenes, she appears on the opposite side of the Aten from Akhenaten, not behind him, not beside him, but mirroring him, as though the sun disk required two royal figures to hold the cosmic balance in place. She was not the queen of a revolution. She was half of one, and the revolution had a face, two faces actually, always shown in profile, always tilted upward toward the rays of the Aten, whose extended hands ended in the Ankh symbol of life, touching the royal couple with a tenderness that was simultaneously divine and strangely intimate. The Aten did not bless armies or smite enemies in the way the old gods had. The Aten, as Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented it, was almost domestic in its warmth, a solar family portrait painted across the walls of an entirely new kind of Egypt. Whether Nefertiti truly believed, or whether she was the sharper political mind behind her husband's spiritual obsession, we cannot say with certainty. But what the stone tells us, in image after image after image, is that she did not simply follow this revolution. She shaped it, she embodied it. She stood in the blinding Egyptian sun with her blue crown catching the light, and her expression unchanged, calm, certain, unreachable, and helped a man tear down 3,000 years of divine order and replace it with something entirely their own. That is not the biography of a supportive wife. That is the biography of a true believer, or someone even more dangerous, someone who understood exactly what belief could build. There is a stretch of land along the eastern bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between the old capitals of Memphis and Thebes, where the desert cliffs curve away from the river in a wide, natural arc. From above, it looks almost like cupped hands, as though the earth itself had formed a cradle and left it empty, waiting. For thousands of years, nothing was built there. No temple, no settlement, no village. The Egyptians, who built everywhere, had looked at this particular piece of land and left it alone, and that to Akhenaten made it perfect. He said the Aten had chosen it, that this untouched land belonged to no other god, carried no old prayers in its sand, held no memory of Amun or Ra or Osiris in its stones. It was clean, theologically blank, the ideal location for the capital city of a new Egypt, a city that would be called Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, and that would rise from the desert Not over decades of careful urban planning, but with the breathless urgency of a man who believed he was building on divine instructions and could not afford to be slow about it. Construction began around 1346 BCE. What followed was extraordinary by any standard of the ancient world. An entire city, summoned from bare limestone cliffs and river silt, in what historians estimate was roughly 3 to 4 years. Workers, tens of thousands of them, cut stone, laid foundations, raised walls, and painted interiors with the feverish momentum of people who understood, consciously or not, that they were not simply building a city. They were building a theology. Every street, every temple, every palace corridor was designed to orient its inhabitants toward the Aten. The main royal road ran straight and wide, built for processions, for the daily spectacle of Akhenaten and Nefertiti riding in their golden chariot from the palace to the great open-air temple, their faces tilted to the sun, the crowd pressing forward on both sides to catch a glimpse of the divine. And Nefertiti lived at the centre of all of it. Her palace, or what excavations suggest was her dedicated residential complex, sat within the royal city with its own gardens, its own painted floors, its own reflection pools that caught the light in colours that archaeologists are still trying to accurately reconstruct. The floor paintings discovered at Amarna are among the most delicate and naturalistic ever found in Egypt. Marsh scenes full of birds mid-flight, fish beneath stylized water, plants bending in a painted breeze. It is art that feels alive, art that suggests whoever commissioned it wanted their daily surroundings to feel less like a monument and more like a world. She walked those floors. She looked at those painted birds every morning. She raised 6 daughters in rooms that smelled of river mud and expensive imported cedar and the particular dry warmth that settles into stone buildings in desert heat. She performed rituals at the great Aten temple, where the roof had been deliberately removed so that worship could happen beneath the open sky, beneath the sun itself, unmediated, direct, the way Akhenaten insisted the divine relationship was meant to work. But the city had a shadow built into its foundation from the very beginning. Akhenaten had made a vow, carved into boundaries stelli planted at intervals around the city's perimeter, massive stone markers that still partially survive today. He swore that Akhetaten would never be expanded beyond its marked boundaries, and that he would never leave it. Not for war, not for diplomacy, not for any reason the old Egypt might have demanded of its pharaoh. The city was not just his capital, it was his commitment, his declaration that there was no going back, and perhaps Nefertiti understood something in that vow that her husband did not. A city built in urgency, dedicated to a single idea, ruled by 2 people who had made powerful enemies of every priest and noble family whose power rested on the old gods. That was not a foundation. That was a gamble. The cliffs that curved so beautifully around Akhetaten were not protective arms, they were walls, and the desert beyond them was not empty. It was patient. Within a generation, the city would be abandoned, the painted floors would be buried, the temples would be dismantled stone by stone, and their blocks reused in later construction, slotted into other buildings, like a language someone was trying to unlearn. The boundary steel would be left standing, because no one could be bothered to move them. And they survive today as the only permanent witnesses to a city that dared to remake the world and ran out of time before the world could be remade. But while it stood, it was extraordinary. While it stood, Nefertiti walked its wide roads in her blue crown, and the sun poured down on the open temple, and the city hummed with the particular energy of people who genuinely believe they are living inside a miracle. They were. They just did not know how briefly. Year 12 of Akhenaten's reign begins like the others before it. The sun rises over Akhetaten. The royal road fills with the sounds of a city at work. The great open temple receives its offerings, and somewhere inside the palace complex, Nefertiti, great royal wife, co-regent, living embodiment of the feminine divine, the woman whose face appears on more temple walls than almost any other figure in Egyptian history, is still very much present. The records confirm it. The imagery confirms it. She is there, vivid and powerful, in year 12, and then she is not. No announcement, no funeral inscription. No tomb prepared and sealed in the Valley of the Queens with the ceremony befitting a woman of her stature. No grieving texts carved by a devastated husband into the walls of a mourning chapel. No record of a burial procession winding through the streets of the city she helped build. Just silence, the specific total silence that the ancient world reserved not for the dead, but for the deliberately forgotten. She vanishes from the official record somewhere between year 12 and year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, and the absence is so complete and so sudden that historians have been arguing about it ever since. Because in ancient Egypt, powerful people did not simply disappear. Death was documented. Disgrace was documented. Even the deaths of lesser officials left some trace in the administrative papyri, some ripple in the record-keeping of a civilization that was meticulous almost to the point of obsession. Nefertiti leaves nothing, and nothing in Egyptology is almost always a clue. The first theory is the simplest, and in some ways the most merciful. She died. Year 12 of Akhenaten's reign coincided with a documented plague that swept through the ancient Near East with devastating efficiency, a pandemic that left its fingerprints in diplomatic correspondence from multiple kingdoms, letters from foreign rulers noting the death of their own people, and cautiously, diplomatically, asking if Egypt had been similarly affected. Several of Nefertiti's daughters disappear from the record around the same period. The loss of children and a beloved wife within a short span of time would explain the silence, not erasure, but grief so profound that a husband who had built an entire theology around his family simply could not bring himself to document what remained. It is a human explanation. It is also perhaps too neat. The second theory is considerably darker, and carries the particular chill of palace politics that has not changed much across 3,000 years of human civilization. Nefertiti fell. Not physically, politically. The argument goes that somewhere in the middle years of Akhenaten's reign, a crack opened between them, theological, personal, or dynastic, and Nefertiti found herself on the wrong side of it. Perhaps she disagreed with the direction of the revolution they had built together. Perhaps she challenged her husband's authority in a way that could not be quietly absorbed. Perhaps a rival gained influence at court. There are scholars who point to a secondary wife named Kia, whose prominence seems to increase precisely as Nefertiti's fades, and who may have provided what Nefertiti's 6 daughters could not, a male heir. Disgrace in ancient Egypt was not a gentle thing. It meant the removal of your name from monuments. It meant the careful, systematic chiseling away of your image from walls that had once celebrated you. It meant becoming, in the official record, someone who had never existed. And there are places in Amarna where Nefertiti's image appears to have been altered or removed, though whether this was done during Akhenaten's reign or in the later, broader erasure of everything connected to the Aten revolution remains frustratingly difficult to determine. But then there is the third theory, and this one does not ask you to mourn her or pity her. This one asks you to look more carefully at what appears in the record right around the time she disappears from it, because someone new shows up. A figure called Nefertiti, a name that Nefertiti herself had used as one of her own royal epithets earlier in the reign, begins appearing in the official record as a co-regent ruling alongside Akhenaten. The titulary is unusual. The imagery associated with this figure is unusual, and a small but growing body of scholarly work argues, with mounting conviction, that Nefertiti was not a new person at all, that the disappearance of Nefertiti and the appearance of Nefertiti are not 2 separate historical events, that they are one event, reading correctly for a very long time, that Nefertiti did not vanish, that she transformed. She had spent her entire career understanding the power of image, the power of representation, the power of controlling how the world perceived you. She had watched her husband chisel away the names of gods he wanted the world to forget. She understood better than almost anyone alive that in Egypt, identity was not fixed. Identity was constructed. Identity was a thing you could build, and if you were skilled enough, you could build it twice. So perhaps the silence is not an ending. Perhaps the silence is a doorway. And on the other side of it, a woman who had already fooled the world once was quietly preparing to do it again. This time, not as a queen. Let us begin with what the evidence actually says, because the evidence is stranger than any story a novelist were old dare to invent. In the later years of Akhenaten's reign, Egyptian records begin referencing a co-regent, a second royal figure, sharing the throne with the pharaoh, in an arrangement that was not unprecedented in Egyptian history, but was always significant, always deliberate, and always political. This co-regent carries the name Nefertiti. In Egyptian royal naming convention, this is not a casual label. Names were chosen with theological precision. They were statements of divine identity, cosmic purpose, and political intention compressed into syllables that the gods themselves were expected to read and recognize. And Nefertiti, meaning roughly beautiful, are the beauties of Aten, was a name that Nefertiti had used as part of her own extended royal title for years before the disappearance. It was, in the most literal sense, already hers. The scholarly debate around what this means has been running for decades, and it runs hot. On one side are those who argue Nefertiti was a separate individual entirely, perhaps one of Akhenaten's daughters, elevated to co-regency as the royal couple aged, and the question of succession grew urgent. On the other side are those who look at the accumulated evidence and arrive at a conclusion that is simultaneously logical and almost breathtaking in its implications. That Nefertiti did not leave the stage. That she simply changed her costume. The physical evidence is fragmentary but suggestive in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Inscriptions associated with Nefertiti carry feminine grammatical markers in certain places, small linguistic signals embedded in the formal language of royal titulary that indicate the person being described is a woman. Egyptian royal language was precise about such things. These markers do not appear by accident. They appear because whoever was composing the official texts was recording the truth of what they knew, even within the elaborate redefinition of identity that a new royal name represented. A woman was wearing this name. A woman was sitting on this throne. There are also artistic clues embedded in the relief carvings from the later Amarna period. Images of Nefertiti that carry physical proportions and stylistic elements consistent with how Nefertiti had been depicted throughout the reign, distinct from the way Akhenaten himself was rendered. Egyptian royal art was not realistic portraiture in the modern sense, but it did employ consistent visual vocabulary to distinguish individuals, particular combinations of crown, collar, body proportion, and pose that functioned like a visual signature, and Nefertiti's visual signature looks, to a striking degree, like Nefertiti's. Consider what this would have required. A woman in ancient Egypt ascending not merely to queenship, which Nefertiti had already achieved and redefined, but to the kingship itself, to the role of pharaoh, to the office that was by theological definition the earthly embodiment of the male divine, the living Horus, the son of the sun. Egyptian history did have female rulers. Hatshepsut had ruled as pharaoh a century before Nefertiti, wearing the double crown and the false beard of kingship, with the calm authority of someone who had decided that tradition was a suggestion rather than a law. But Hatshepsut operated within the established religious framework of multiple gods and deep institutional structures that could absorb the anomaly of a female king and file it carefully away. Nefertiti, if she did this, would have been doing it inside a radical new religious order that her husband had invented, with enemies circling at every border of both the physical and ideological kingdom, with a population that had been wrenched from its gods and not yet fully reconciled to the replacement. And she may have done it anyway. There is a theory, speculative but structurally coherent, that Akhenaten's health declined significantly in the later years of his reign, and that Nefertiti stepped into the administrative and ceremonial vacuum not as a usurper, but as a necessity. That the transformation into Nefertiti was a practical solution to a practical crisis, dressed in the theological language of the Artin Revolution because that was the only language the court of Akhenaten recognized as legitimate. She had always been depicted as nearly equal in divine authority. The step from nearly equal to fully sovereign may have been smaller in that particular court than it would have been anywhere else in Egyptian history. And then there is Smenkhkare, another name that flickers briefly in the record around the same period, another co-regent whose identity is almost equally contested, and whom some scholars believe may represent yet another phase of the same transformation. The same woman moving through names the way a skilled operator moves through rooms, purposefully, quietly, leaving just enough trace to be followed and just enough ambiguity to never be fully caught. If any version of this is true, then what Nefertiti accomplished was not merely survival, it was reinvention at the highest possible level, a masterclass in identity, power, and the ancient art of making yourself into whatever the moment required. She had spent years helping Akhenaten erase the names of gods from temple walls. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a name was not a fixed thing, that it could be set down and picked up, that the person beneath the crown mattered infinitely more than whatever the crown was currently called. The woman who had arrived in the historical record with no traceable origin, no confirmed birthplace, no father's name, carved proudly into stone. That same woman may have looked at the crumbling edges of her husband's revolution and decided, with the same calm that never left her sculpted face, that she was not finished yet. Every empire ends. That is not pessimism. It is simply the oldest pattern in human history, repeated so consistently across so many civilizations that it begins to feel less like tragedy and more like physics. Things rise, things fall. The only variable is what survives the falling. Akhenaten died somewhere around 1336 BCE, and the world he had built with such furious conviction began to come apart almost immediately. The priests of Amun, who had spent years in enforced silence watching their temples stripped and their gods erased, moved back toward power with the quiet momentum of people who had been patient for a very long time and were done being patient. The new religious order, the Aten, the open temples, the radical intimacy of a sun disk that needed no intermediaries, began to dissolve. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the slow, inexorable way that ideas dissolve when the person who believed in them most fiercely is no longer alive to defend them. A boy ascended the throne. Tutankhamun, perhaps Akhenaten's son, perhaps Nefertiti's grandson, perhaps something more complicated than either, was approximately 8 or 9 years old when the double crown was placed on his head. He was a child inheriting a crisis, the court around him, older, cannier, thoroughly exhausted by the Aten experiment, guided his small hands back toward the old gods. The name Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, was changed to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun. The capital moved back south. The great open temple at Akhenaten fell silent, and slowly, deliberately, the people who needed the revolution to be forgotten began the work of getting it. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from monuments. His image was defaced. The boundary steel of Akhenaten were left standing in the desert, not as memorials but as irrelevancies, too remote, too associated with failure, too much effort to destroy completely. The city itself was abandoned, its stones quarried and reused, its painted floors buried under sand that would not be disturbed for 3,000 years. Later Egyptian king lists, the official records of royal succession, simply skip the entire Amarna period. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun's immediate predecessors, all of them excised from the official story as though the entire chapter had been written in erasable ink. It was, by any measure, a comprehensive act of historical deletion, and it almost worked. For 3,000 years, it almost worked. And then, December 6, 1912, a German excavator reaches into the rubble of a forgotten workshop in the desert and pulls out a painted limestone face. And everything that 3,000 years of deliberate forgetting had accomplished begins, quietly and then all at once, to unravel. Because here is what the priests of Ammon and the advisors of Tutankhamun and the later pharaohs who scrubbed Akhenaten from their king lists did not account for. They planned for stone. They planned for inscriptions and monuments and official records, the machinery of memory that Egypt had always used to construct and control its history. They did not plan for a sculptor's workshop model left behind in the collapse of a city, buried under sand, waiting with the particular patience of objects that have no reason to hurry. They did not plan for her face. The bust arrived in Berlin, and the 20th century did not know what to do with something so ancient that felt so immediate. She was reproduced on postcards, on magazine covers, in encyclopedia dias, in museum gift shops, in documentaries, in novels, in fashion editorials where photographers placed modern women in profile beside her image and noted, with varying degrees of astonishment, that the geometry held, that the proportions that the sculptor had rendered in limestone around 1345 BCE still read, to modern eyes trained on modern aesthetics, as extraordinary, as beautiful, as contemporary in a way that nothing quite that old has any right to be. Egypt had tried to erase her. The desert had buried her. 3 millennia had passed over her like weather, and she had simply waited, one eye open, expression unchanged, for the world to catch up. But her survival was never really about the bust. The bust is evidence. What Nefertiti actually left behind was something harder to chisel away and harder to bury. The proof that a woman could walk into a civilization with no recorded origin, rise to the highest levels of religious and political power, potentially reshape her own identity to survive a revolution's collapse, and do all of it so skillfully that, thousands of years later, we are still arguing about the details, still debating which name she used, still trying to find her tomb, her body, her final chapter. Still reaching into the rubble of her story, looking for the piece that makes everything else make sense. She has not given it to us. And that, perhaps, is the most Nefertiti thing about her. The woman who managed her image with such extraordinary precision in life has managed it with equal precision across 33 centuries of death. She has given us enough to be obsessed and withheld enough to keep us searching. The missing eye is not a flaw in the bust. It is a philosophy. It is the portrait of a woman who understood that what you do not show is as powerful as what you do. Tutankhamun was found in 1922, 10 years after Nefertiti's bust. His tomb, as intact, overflowing with gold and treasures, the most spectacular archaeological discovery in modern history. He has museums, documentaries, travelling exhibitions, his own Netflix series. He is undeniably famous. And yet, ask anyone on any street, in any city in the world, to name a face from ancient Egypt, and more often than not, they will describe hers. The high cheekbones, the long neck, the blue crown. The calm, knowing expression of someone who was never particularly impressed by the room she was standing in. She fooled the ancient world by becoming a king with someone else's name. She fooled time by surviving in a sculptor's leftover draft. And she fools us still, every time we look at that face and think we are close to understanding her, only to find that she has already moved, already transformed, already become something we have not thought to look for yet. The beautiful one has come, and she has never, not once, considered leaving.